Welcome to a tutorial video on learning Python. In this video, I'm going to talk about objects. Within programming, there are a number of different dominant paradigms, ways of thinking about code. One of them is object-oriented programming. It is a way of taking a task or solving some problem and breaking it up into objects. These objects have attributes or properties, things that describe what they are, things about them, as well as functions, sometimes called methods, and ways to relate to other objects. That is, we take some task, we're trying to solve some problem, we break it up into the parts, but the parts are called objects, different ways that exist, different things, nouns sometimes, and how they relate to each other. So, functions and methods, as well as attributes or properties, depending on the programming language and the context. What this means is we can use object-oriented programming model, the paradigm of thinking about projects and thinking about solutions within Python. And these are called objects. So we can relate to things, create examples within code using these objects, and then how they relate to other things. Let's look at some code here. So we see over on the left-hand side, lines 1 through 11. Lines 1 through 7 define an object. That is, when it's used, we've set down the blueprint. This is how this object works. The name of this object is person. We know that because the very first thing is the class keyword. A class defines the blueprint for an object. When this object is created, it will look like this. So we see the class keyword, the name of this object, person, and then a colon. Similar to the previous video when I was talking about how we define functions using the colon and then things that are indented within this, we see that same syntax here to talk about objects. So we see class, person, colon. Now, moving into a class, it can contain functions. Similar to how we talked about variables and then moved into talking about lists. And lists could contain multiple values, whereas a variable could only contain one. A class can contain multiple functions. So we're building in complexity across these videos. So we have an object that has functions. So, this first function in it, initialize, may look a little confusing because it has two underscores on each side of this. Well, this is because Python wasn't created with object-oriented programming in mind. You can use it for object-oriented programming, but you can also use it for other models and paradigms. However, if we want to initialize, set some initial values within an object, we have to use this special name, init, with two underscores on each side. This allows us to send data into an object using a function. As I discussed in a previous video, we can send data into a function and get data out of a function. We can also send data into a function to just do something for us. And that's what this does. This allows us to send data into a function because the function is part of an object. We're sending data into the object at the same time. We know this because the very first thing we're sending in is a special keyword here called self. This says send a reference to the object into the function that is a part of it. If that sounds a little confusing, it is. But what this allows us to do is reference things within the object, reference itself inside functions that are part of that object. This is all a little confusing, but it basically allows us to do this. So, in this function, notice def, defining a new function, initialize, two underscores on each side because it's special, self, name, and ID. We're sending three things into this function. Using self, we can describe things that are part of the object. So, self.name means there is an attribute or a property, something that describes this object, that is part of this object. So self.name means there's something called name, we're now defining here, that is part of this object. So self.name means this object has something called name. We're assigning it the value of name, which means anything we send into this becomes its name. Down here we see self.age, and we're sending ID into this. Self.age becomes ID. Moving on to the next function, we see using def, defining a function, say hello, self, again because this function is part of an object, print hello, my name is, and then self.name. Self.name allows us to refer to some variable that's part of an object. Now that we've started to get a grasp on objects, let's use them. So down here on line 9, we see P1, which is a variable, is equal to person. We're sending into person and some initial values. We're sending Dan and 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you may ask yourself, wait a minute, where did self go? Well, self is defined only within its definition within the object. If we don't give it anything, it knows that self refers to itself. So we don't have to send that value in. So we see we are creating a new person, initializing a new person with the value Dan and 1, 2, 3, 4, which is an ID and its age. Then on line 10, we're saying say hello, which calls print hello, my name is self name. Let's see that in practice. Hello, my name is Dan. So we sent Dan into person, which, because this is initialize a special function, it set self name to name, self age to ID. Then once self name existed, we could then call say hello to look at self name. So when we're creating objects in Python, we do so by defining a blueprint or a way it should look. We do that using the class keyword, then its name, and then a colon. Everything spaced after that will be part of that object. Objects can have functions. Objects can also have variables. They are, like we talked about, the progression from variables by themselves to lists that can hold different values. A class can hold variables and functions. So we're building to more abstract and more complex ideas. So when we want to initialize, that is give an initial values to a function that is part of an object, we use init. Notice 2 underscores on each side. We're also using self because it is part of an object that allows us to refer to things that are part of itself. We're sending in name and ID. Self.name is a variable that is part of the object. Name of the variable is name. So person.name, in this case we're assigning it name, person.age, assigning it to an ID. Then in say hello, we're printing hello, my name is, and self.name, person.name. Down here, we're creating a new object that's going to be the value of the variable P1 is equal to person Dan 1, 2, 3, 4, which is name and ID, which allows us to do person1 dot say hello. Notice it's the same syntax as self.name, so we're referring to something that's part of an object. Say hello, hello, my name is Dan. So objects in Python are a little bit more complex, but they allow us to use object-oriented programming, that is breaking up complex solutions into objects and how they relate to each other, to begin to solve bigger problems. Thanks for watching.